Today, we sit down with Catherine, a 68-year-old widow whose life is a testament to sacrifice and resilience. She lost her husband when she was just 32 and raised her only son single-handedly, working double shifts, selling her most precious belongings, and putting her own dreams aside so that he could have a better future. Known to her grandchildren as Nana, Catherine carries the strength of a woman who has endured hardship, betrayal, and silence, yet continues to stand tall with quiet dignity. This is her story. Now listen to her story from her own words.
The words that pierced my heart, a mother's journey from burden to strength. There are moments in life when a single word can shatter everything you believed about yourself, about your place in the world, about the people you love most. I experienced that moment on a Tuesday evening in October, standing in my own hallway, listening to my daughter-in-law speak about me as if I were nothing more than an unwanted piece of furniture. "She's becoming such a burden," Lisa's voice drifted through the thin walls, each syllable landing like a physical blow to my chest. "I can't even have friends over anymore without her hovering around, and she's always got something to say about how I raised the kids. Honestly, Michael, I don't know how much longer I can take this. My name is Catherine, and I am 68 years old. For the past 3 years, I had lived in this house, the house I had helped them buy, the house where I thought I belonged." I pressed my back against the cool wall of the hallway, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain they could hear it in the next room. The grocery bags in my hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy, filled with ingredients for the dinner I had planned to cook for them, for my grandchildren who called me Nana with such sweet voices. But it was my son's response I waited for, my Michael, the boy I had raised with these very hands, the man whose silence now stretched longer than any words could have. The pause felt eternal, filled with the weight of 38 years of motherhood, of sacrifice, of unconditional love that I had believed was unbreakable. His response that night was something I never expected, but to understand its full impact, you need to know the woman I was before those words broke me. Looking back now, I can trace the path of my sacrifices like breadcrumbs leading through a dark forest, each one taking me further from the life I might have lived and deeper into a devotion that would nearly consume me. It started when Michael was just 7 years old, the night his father didn't come home from the construction site. One phone call changed everything. A widow at 32, left with a mortgage, a child, and dreams that suddenly seemed as fragile as spiderwebs in a storm. I remember the weight of that first decision, standing in our tiny kitchen with bills spread across the table like fallen leaves. I could sell the house and move to my sister's cramped apartment, or I could find a way to keep our home, to give my boy the stability his father's death had stolen from us. I chose to fight. The years that followed were a blur of double shifts at the hospital where I worked as a nurse, my feet aching in shoes I couldn't afford to replace, my hands raw from the extra cleaning jobs I took on weekends. I sold my wedding ring first, the modest diamond that had meant everything to me, then my mother's pearl earrings, then piece by piece, every item of value I owned. Each sale felt like cutting away a part of myself, but Michael's future was worth more than any material possession. I worked through Michael's school plays, missing the moments I had dreamed of witnessing, so I could afford the music lessons he loved. I ate peanut butter sandwiches for months so he could have the sports equipment his teammates took for granted. When he wanted to go to college, I took out loans that would follow me into my golden years, borrowing against a future I wasn't certain I would live to see. But even then, during those grueling years of single motherhood, there were signs I chose to ignore. When Michael brought Lisa home during his junior year, I noticed the way she looked at our modest house, her eyes cataloging every outdated fixture, every piece of secondhand furniture. When they announced their engagement, she suggested we have the reception at somewhere more appropriate code, for somewhere that wouldn't embarrass her in front of her friends. I brushed off the small slights, the subtle dismissals, the way she would reorganize my kitchen when she visited, as if my way of doing things was inherently wrong. Love makes us blind to red flags, and my love for my son extended to accepting anyone who made him happy, even when that acceptance came at the cost of my own dignity. I believed my sacrifices had built unshakable loyalty between us, a bond forged in the fire of shared struggle and mutual devotion. But shadows had already begun to grow in places I was too trusting to look. The shift in our household dynamic didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual erosion, like water slowly wearing away stone, until what once seemed solid crumbles without warning. It started with small things, conversations that stopped when I entered a room, glances exchanged between Michael and Lisa that I wasn't meant to understand, a growing sense that my presence had become an inconvenience rather than a blessing. Family dinners, once warm affairs filled with laughter and stories, grew cold and stilted. I would cook for hours, preparing Michael's favorite dishes with the same love I had poured into his meals throughout his childhood, only to sit at a table where my contributions to conversation were met with polite but distant responses. Lisa would check her phone constantly, sighing audibly when I shared memories or offered gentle advice about the grandchildren I adored. I began to notice how quickly they ushered the children away when I tried to spend time with them, how my offers to help with homework or bedtime stories were declined with increasingly thin excuses. The house I had helped them purchase with my life insurance payout, when my own health scare reminded us all of mortality, to feel like a place I was visiting rather than living. Yet, I clung to hope with the desperation of a drowning woman reaching for driftwood. Surely Michael would remember the woman who had worked herself to exhaustion for his future. Surely the boy who had once crawled into my bed during thunderstorms would not allow his mother to be slowly erased from his life. I told myself that marriage was an adjustment, that new mothers were naturally protective, that time would heal whatever distance had grown between us. That hope shattered the night she said those words aloud. And I realized that my son's silence wasn't confusion or conflict, it was choice. The living room was dimly lit by the lamp I had bought them as a housewarming gift, its warm glow casting shadows that seemed to dance mockingly across the walls as I stood frozen in the hallway. Lisa sat curled on the couch I had helped them pick out, had contributed money toward when their budget fell short, her voice carrying that particular tone of exasperation I had grown to recognize and dread. "She's becoming such a burden," she repeated, and this time the word hit me with the full force of its cruelty. Verdun. After 38 years of putting my son's needs before my own, after sacrificing my youth, my health, my financial security for his future, I had become a burden. The woman who had worked double shifts to keep him in school, who had sold her most precious possessions to pay for his wedding, who had moved in with them not because I needed them but because they had asked for help with the children. That woman was now nothing more than an unwelcome weight. "I mean, look at tonight," Lisa continued, her voice growing sharper with each word. "I had to cancel dinner with the Hendersons because she was in one of her moods, asking all those questions about Emma's schoolwork, like she has any right to interfere. It's exhausting, Michael. She acts like she owns this place, like we owe her something just because she helped with the down payment." The grocery bags slipped from my numb fingers, hitting the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo through my chest like a gunshot. I had spent my afternoon carefully selecting ingredients for Michael's favorite pot roast, the same recipe I had perfected during those lean years, when it was often the only luxury we could afford. The onions I had chosen with such care rolled across the hallway floor, and I watched them scatter like the pieces of my broken heart. But it was what came next that truly destroyed me, not Lisa's words, which I had begun to expect, but my son's response, or rather, his lack of one. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled with 30 years of bedtime stories, scraped knees kissed better, proud moments at graduations and achievements. I waited for him to defend me, to remind his wife of the sacrifices I had made, to honor the woman who had given him everything. Instead, I heard the soft creak of the couch as he shifted, the quiet intake of breath that preceded words I somehow knew would cut deeper than anything Lisa had said. And then, my son finally opened his mouth, and the words that emerged were a betrayal beyond anything I had imagined possible. "Maybe you're right," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper, but loud enough to shatter what remained of my world. "Maybe it's time we talked to her about other arrangements. She could be happy in one of those senior communities, right? They have activities, people her own age. It might be better for everyone." Other arrangements, senior communities. The clinical language couldn't disguise what he was really saying. He wanted to dispose of me like an inconvenient problem, to shuffle me off to some institutional waiting room for death where I wouldn't embarrass his wife or complicate his comfortable life. I stood there trembling, not from cold but from a rage so pure it felt like fire in my veins. This was my son, the boy who had cried in my arms when kids at school teased him about his second-hand clothes. The teenager who had promised he would always take care of me the way I had taken care of him. The man who now spoke about discarding me with the same casual tone he might use to discuss replacing an old appliance. I walked into that living room, with my spine straight and my head held high, even as my heart cracked with each step. They looked up at me with expressions of guilt and defiance, knowing they had been caught but not yet understanding the full magnitude of their betrayal. Other arrangements, I repeated, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Is that what we're calling it when a son abandons the mother who sacrificed everything for him? Lisa's face flushed, but her eyes remained cold and calculating. Catherine, you're being dramatic. We're just thinking about what's best for everyone. You'd have friends your own age. Activities don't. I cut her off, my voice sharp enough to slice through her practiced manipulation. Don't you dare try to dress up your selfishness as concern for my welfare. Michael finally met my eyes. And what I saw there was worse than hatred. It was pity mixed with inconvenience. The look you might give a stray dog you no longer wanted to feed. Mom, he began, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I remembered from his teenage years when he thought he knew better than everyone else. You're taking this wrong. We're not saying we don't want you here, but maybe it would be healthier for you to have more independence. Independence. The word came out as a bitter laugh. You mean the independence to die alone while you forget I ever existed? If they thought I was weak, if they believed the woman who had survived widowhood, poverty, and decades of sacrifice would simply fade away at their convenience, they were about to learn otherwise. The days that followed were the darkest I had experienced since my husband's death, but they were also illuminating in ways I hadn't expected. Grief has a way of stripping away illusions, of showing you the world as it truly is, rather than as you hoped it might be. I spent hours in my room, the small bedroom they had given me, barely larger than Michael's childhood, closets staring at the ceiling and confronting truths I had been avoiding for years. I was not a beloved family matriarch. I was unpaid domestic help that had outlived its usefulness. I was not a cherished grandmother. I was an obstacle to the nuclear family Lisa wanted to create without the inconvenience of extended relations. Most painfully, I was not an honored mother. I was a reminder of obligations my son would prefer to forget. But in that darkness, something else began to grow, a fierce determination that surprised me with its intensity. I thought about the women who had raised me. My grandmother who had survived the Depression with nothing but willpower and dignity. My mother who had worked in factories during the war, while maintaining a home and raising 3 children. I came from a line of women who did not beg for respect. They commanded it through their actions and their refusal to accept less than they deserved. I began to make phone calls, quiet conversations with old friends I had neglected during my years of devoted motherhood. Eleanor, my closest friend from nursing school, listened to my story with the righteous anger of someone who understood sacrifice. Catherine, she said, her voice firm with conviction, you don't owe them gratitude for tolerating you. They owe you respect for creating them. Those words became my anchor as I began to formulate a plan that would restore not just my dignity, but my power. I wasn't going to argue or plead or try to convince them of my worth. I was going to show them the consequences of treating a woman of substance as if she were disposable. The papers I held in my hands 3 weeks later would change everything. But first, I had to gather the courage to use them. The law office smelled of leather and old books, scents that should have been comforting but instead felt heavy with the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. Mr. Patterson, the family lawyer who had handled my husband's estate and helped me navigate those early years of widowhood, spread the documents across his mahogany desk with the careful precision of someone who understood their significance. You're certain about this, Catherine? He asked, his weathered face creased with concern. Once we filed these papers, there's no going back. The house will be legally yours again, and they'll have 30 days to make alternative arrangements. I thought about Michael's voice, saying other arrangements with such casual cruelty, and my resolve hardened like steel in a forge. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. The documents told a story that Lisa and Michael had conveniently forgotten, or perhaps had never truly understood. When they had needed help with the down payment 5 years ago, I hadn't simply given them money. I had signed over the deed to my own home, the house I had fought so hard to keep after my husband's death, and used that equity to make their dream possible. Legally, I owned 60% of their home, a fact that had been buried under years of assumed dependency and manufactured gratitude. But there was more. The life insurance policy I had cashed in to help with Michael's wedding had included provisions that protected my investment, the loan I had co-signed for their car, the credit cards I had guaranteed when their young credit couldn't qualify them for decent rates, all of it created a web of financial obligation that they had either ignored or forgotten. The beauty of this, Mr. Patterson explained as he prepared the papers, is that everything is completely legal. You're not taking anything that isn't rightfully yours, you're simply reclaiming what you allowed them to use. I left that office with a folder full of legal documents, and a heart full of quiet determination. Eleanor met me for coffee afterward, her eyes bright with anticipation. "When are you going to tell them?" "I'm not going to tell them," I replied, stirring sugar into my cup with hands that no longer trembled. "I'm going to show them, this Sunday, when the whole family comes for dinner. Let them learn what it means to underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose." The papers I held in my hands would change everything, but more than that. They would remind my son and his wife that respect is not given, it is earned, and it can be withdrawn just as deliberately as it is offered. Sunday dinner had always been sacred in our family, a tradition I had maintained through Michael's childhood and carried into his married life, even during the darkest days of our recent tension. The weekly gathering continued, sustained by my cooking and orchestrated around my efforts to maintain family bonds that seemed increasingly fragile. This particular Sunday, I prepared the meal with unusual care, knowing it might be the last time I served them in the capacity they had taken for granted. The dining room filled with the familiar sounds of family: Lisa's sister Rachel and her husband, Michael's cousin David and his children, the gentle chaos of multiple conversations and competing demands for attention. I watched it all from my position at the kitchen doorway, noting how naturally Lisa had assumed the role of hostess in my own home, how easily Michael accepted credit for the elaborate spread I had spent 2 days preparing. They had no idea that the woman they had dismissed as a burden was about to reclaim her power in the most definitive way possible. "Mom makes the best pot roast," Michael said to his cousin, his voice warm with the casual affection that had once meant everything to me. It was the first kind word he had spoken about me in weeks, and the irony wasn't lost on me. He praised my cooking, even as he planned to exile the cook. I waited until dessert was served, until the conversation had settled into the comfortable rhythm of family gossip and shared memories. Then I stood, my hands steady, as I reached for the folder I had placed on the kitchen counter that morning. "I have something I need to share with everyone," I announced, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room. Lisa looked up with barely concealed annoyance, probably expecting another one of my tedious stories about the grandchildren or my health concerns. Michael's expression was wary, as if he sensed something different in my tone, but couldn't quite identify the shift. I opened the folder with deliberate care, removing the first document, the original deed that showed my ownership of the house they thought was theirs. 5 years ago, when Michael and Lisa needed help buying this home, I transferred ownership of my property to make their down payment possible. What I didn't mention at the time was that this made me the majority owner of this house. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the sound of children playing in the backyard, the distant hum of traffic that had never seemed so loud. Lisa's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then a dawning horror, as she began to understand what I was saying. "That's not, you can't just ... I can, actually," I replied, placing the second document on the table. "This is a notice of intention to reclaim full property rights. You have 30 days to buy out my share at current market value, or make alternative living arrangements." Michael's face had gone pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The cousin who had praised my pot roast minutes before now stared at me with something approaching awe, while Rachel looked between her sister and me with the fascination of someone watching a particularly dramatic television show. "You can't do this to us," Lisa finally managed, her voice shaking with a rage that made her previous cruelties seem mild by comparison. "We have children, we have a life here. You can't just throw us out because you're having some kind of breakdown." That word breakdown hung in the air, like smoke from a fire, and I felt the last vestiges of my maternal guilt burn away in its heat. "I'm not throwing you out," I said calmly. "I'm simply reclaiming what was always mine, the same way you were planning to reclaim your independence by putting me in a senior community." Michael's face crumbled as he realized I had heard everything, that his private conversation with his wife had been witnessed by the woman they had been so casually discussing like a piece of unwanted furniture. His guilt was written across his features in lines that made him look older than his 38 years. But the fallout was only just beginning, and I was surprised by how satisfying it felt to watch their world shift on its axis the way mine had just weeks before. The explosion of Lisa's rage was immediate and volcanic, a display of raw fury that revealed the person she had always been beneath her carefully maintained facade of respectability. "How dare you?" she screamed, her face flushed red with indignation. "After everything we've done for you, letting you live here, including you and our family, including me," I interrupted, my voice cutting through her hysteria like a blade. "In the home I helped you buy, eating food I purchased and prepared, caring for children I love while you treated me like hired help. That kind of inclusion." The extended family watched this confrontation with the horrified fascination of witnesses to a natural disaster. Rachel's mouth hung open in shock, while David's children pressed closer to their parents, sensing the adult tensions they couldn't fully understand. But it was Michael's reaction that surprised me most. Instead of supporting his wife's outrage or defending their behavior, he sat in stunned silence, his face a mask of shame and dawning comprehension. Perhaps for the first time, he was seeing the situation through my eyes, understanding the full weight of what they had planned to do to the woman who had sacrificed everything for his future. "Michael, say something," Lisa demanded, turning to her husband with desperation born of watching her comfortable life crumble before her eyes. "Tell her she can't do this to us." But Michael didn't speak. He couldn't, because we all knew that everything I had done was perfectly legal, perfectly justified, and long overdue. The mother he had planned to discard was not the helpless, dependent he had imagined. She was a woman of substance who had simply chosen to be generous until generosity was repaid with betrayal. The whispers started immediately, rippling through our extended family like waves from a stone dropped in still water. By the time our relatives left that evening, the story had already begun to spread. How Lisa had called her mother-in-law a burden, how Michael had planned to abandon the woman who had raised him, how a son's ingratitude had been met with a mother's quiet justice. She thought she could erase me from their lives with the casual cruelty of someone disposing of an inconvenience. Instead, she had erased herself from the moral high ground she had claimed for so long, revealing the smallness of her character to everyone who mattered. The weeks that followed brought a transformation I hadn't anticipated, a shift in how the world saw me that felt like stepping from shadow into sunlight. The story of my reclamation spread through our community with the speed of all truly satisfying tales of justice. And everywhere I went, I encountered a respect I hadn't experienced in years. Mrs. Chen from the grocery store stopped me in the produce aisle to tell me how proud she was of my courage. "Too many of us become invisible as we age," she said, her weathered hands gripping mine with surprising strength. "You reminded us that we still have power." My former colleagues from the hospital reached out with invitations and offers of friendship I had thought lost forever. They had watched from a distance as I disappeared into the role of devoted mother and grandmother, and now they welcomed back the woman they remembered, competent, strong, worthy of respect and companionship. Even the house felt different now that the power dynamics had shifted. I moved back into the master bedroom, my bedroom, and converted the smaller room into the office I had always wanted. Michael and Lisa took the basement apartment with a separate entrance, an arrangement that provided the physical and emotional distance we all needed. While they figured out their next steps, Michael tried to rebuild our relationship with the tentative gestures of someone who finally understood the magnitude of his betrayal. He brought me flowers on my birthday. Flowers I accepted but didn't gush over. He offered to cook dinner on Sundays, offers I declined with polite but firm explanations that I preferred my own company. He asked for forgiveness with the desperation of someone who had gambled away something precious and only realized its value after it was gone. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said one afternoon, finding me in my garden where I had planted vegetables for the first time in years. "I don't know what I was thinking." The pressure was, I should never have let her speak about you that way. I looked at my son, really looked at him, saw not the man I had raised but the boy who had once hidden behind my skirts when the world felt too big and scary. But some betrayals create distances that can never be fully bridged, and some trust, once broken, can never be completely repaired. "I know you're sorry," I told him, my hands steady as I planted seeds that would grow long after this conversation was forgotten. "But sorry doesn't undo the years of disrespect. Sorry doesn't erase the fact that when your wife called me a burden, you agreed with her. And so, I found freedom not in their approval, not in their gratitude or their guilt-driven attempts at reconciliation, but in myself, in the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had reclaimed her dignity and discovered that respect, once demanded, could transform not just how others saw her, but how she saw herself. There is a particular peace that comes with age and wisdom, a clarity that allows you to see patterns and truths that were invisible in youth's desperate need for acceptance and love. I stand now at 71 years old, looking back on a life marked by sacrifice and service, betrayal and resurrection, and I want to share with you the lessons that this experience burned into my heart. No parent should ever be called a burden by the children they raised, loved, and sacrificed for. We are not inconveniences to be managed or problems to be solved. We are human beings who deserve respect not because of what we can offer, but because of our inherent dignity as people who have lived, loved, and contributed to the world. The silence of those who should defend us is often more devastating than the cruelty of those who attack us. My son's refusal to speak up when his wife called me a burden was a betrayal that cut deeper than her words ever could. Silence in the face of disrespect is not neutrality, it's complicity, and it teaches cruel people that their cruelty will be tolerated. Love without respect is not love at all, it is manipulation dressed in prettier clothes. For too long, I accepted treatment that diminished my worth because I confused enabling their comfort with showing my love. Real love demands that we hold each other accountable to higher standards, that we refuse to accept behavior that damages our dignity or theirs. The power to change our circumstances often lies dormant within us, waiting for the moment when we become more committed to our self-respect than to keeping peace. I lived for years in a situation that was slowly killing my spirit because I was afraid of conflict, afraid of being seen as difficult, afraid of losing what little place I had in their lives. But there are fates worse than conflict, and being treated as disposable is one of them. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, respect is not something we can beg for or earn through endless service. It is something we must demand through our actions and our refusal to accept less. The moment I stopped asking for their approval and started asserting my rights, everything changed. Not because they suddenly became better people, but because I became someone who would no longer tolerate being treated as less than I was worth. To any mother, father, or elder who recognizes their own story in mind, know this: you are not a burden. You are not too sensitive. You are not asking for too much when you expect basic human decency from the people you have loved most. Your worth is not determined by your usefulness to others, and your right to respect is not dependent on anyone else's permission. Respect is not begged for, it is lived, earned, and demanded with quiet strength. It rises from the unshakable knowledge that you have value that cannot be diminished by others' inability to see it, and it grows stronger every time you choose your dignity over their comfort.